I am your host, Jason Miles, and this is Revolution Podcast. Happy Monday to many of you. Happy Sunday to the patrons out there. Hope you're having a very good end of your weekend. And for the rest of you, start the week off right. Let's start the week off with our weekly news roundup. We call it that and we don't know why. We used to have foreign policy Thursdays, and as we had more guests that couldn't fit exactly into foreign policy Thursday, or we try to make something make sense for foreign policy Thursday, we're like, no, we're just going to do it. We'll call it the weekly news roundup, but it's a little more evergreen than that. It's not simply the hot stories of the week. And this one got a tad spicy. Pascal and Derick Varn came on to fill in because the normal voice you're used to hearing, everyone's favorite middle manager of a moon-sized, planet-destroying space station, deep state Kuba, Wrzesniewski, couldn't make it. So Varn was kind enough to come in, fill in. And another thing that we're adding to the Thursday show, Thursday live show, or Monday show, if you will, is our good friend and journalist in Lima, Peru, Camilo Gomez. Camilo does cover Latin America, and he's just a great resource on what's going on in Latin America. And we definitely took the MMT conversation, and in the bonus patrons only champagne room, got Camilo to weigh in on how the current U.S. economy is affecting Latin America. And Derick does mention Brazil a little bit in his rant. He sent me a message. I was like, what do you want to talk about, Derick? And he said, before we start bloviating on geopolitics that we know nothing about, we must understand the current state of the economy. I believe that is a quote from the message she sent me. But Derick, of course, doesn't talk like that. He doesn't have that sort of accent. We had a good time. Varn was cracking up. If you watch the show Varn Vlog, whatever you're listening to this show, there's links in the description to Varn Vlog. Please go follow Varn. He's so serious. He's so upset. So I love it when he comes on. He gets the giggles out on our show. But he's also very serious. So a very serious conversation was had about MMT, which was kind of an accident. There's a few words you say in these left online spaces. Stalin is another word that if you say it, there will be tons of comments and engagement. Say it on purpose or an accident. But if you want to hear the deeper dive we take with Camilo about Latin America, become a patron. Patreon.com/Bitter Lake Presents. Wherever you are listening to this, there's links in the description. We're trying to get to 10,000 YouTube subscribers. So if you're listening to the show, there's a link to YouTube. Click that subscribe button. We're almost there. That music means I've been going on for too long. Thank you so much. And I am out. Good evening. This is Revolutionaries. Welcome to another weekly roundup. This is Revolution Podcast. I'm going to steal your term, Omar. This is Revolutionaries. I like that. I like it. Well, welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. I am your host, Jason Miles. We will be without everyone's favorite middle manager of the Death Star and the Deep State. Deep State Kuba will not be able to join us, but we have an extremely suitable qualified replacement. Before we bring that gentleman in, let me bring in, even before I bring in the co-host, for those of you that are new to the show, please hit the like and subscribe button. We're trying to get to 10,000 subscribers by the end of the month. Don't know if that can happen as the month is coming close to an end. And don't forget to hit the bell so you're notified every time we go live. We've been adding new programming constantly in the new year. We've been doing video essays. There's a new video essay that I recently finished. It's up now. I think it's the name of a Backstreet Boys song. I can't remember the name, but basically is asking the question, is the online left grift? So check that out. We have a playlist of all our video essays. Our video essays are usually comprised of things that most of us wrote. Myself, Pascal. Kuba has a really great essay on the Russian Revolution, and there's going to be more dope shit. So check that out. That being said, let me bring in my co-host, my homie, my dog. He is the man of the Mount. Had a very good show last night that was accidentally public. So all of you got to join in on that one. That was fun. Asking the question of Dr. Martin Luther King, was King right? He is the Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Somebody says I'm waiting for the Book of Kuba to come on Disney Plus. Someone noticed that the album behind me is pointed at his head. Yes. On all of This is Revolution show, I will have a different album, various genres behind me. I recently did a patron call. If you are the top tier patron, you get to have a conversation with all of us during the month.
You did another patron call today?
Not today. I did not do another patron call today, but for whatever reason, people want to do a patron call with me. Just to let you guys know, do a patron call with Pascal. He's way more entertaining.
I don't know if that's true.
He's the lovable face of the show.
I think that's the other way around.
No.
I've been told by friends of ours of the show that it's a good cop, bad cop, and you're the good cop, and I'm the bad cop. I don't know. Why do we have to be cops?
Yeah, why can't we be good thug and bad thug? I guess that's racist.
Or good community servants and bad community servants. Why can't somebody come on?
We just always got to be cops. We are the police of the online left. That being said, let's bring in the police commissioner of the online left. You may know him as a former host of Pop the Left. You may know him as the host of Varn Vlog, which all of us have been on except me. Won't have me on. He says I'll have Pascal on, and I've filled my colored quota. He is the Derick Varn.
Wait, Varn had us on together one time.
I think I'm busting his balls extremely hard. It's just I had to do it because this is a serious show. I do have to go off screen and help Camilo out for a little bit. So we're going to do our weekend
or weekly roundup show. And once we're done in the bonus champagne room, we'll be joined by a friend of show, Camilo Gomez. And we're going to talk all things South America and especially Peru. So, if you're a patron, link's already up. Get ready. If you're not a patron, you want to hear this conversation, be part of this conversation, because we do put the chat on the screen and interact with you guys in the patron bonus champagne room. Patreon.com/Bitter Lake Presents. But you guys have some things you want to discuss this evening. Derick hit me up and he goes, I want to talk the market. I want to talk the economy. Like, okay, all right. He got serious with me. He said, before we bloviate.
Juan said that?
I think I made up bloviate.
No, that's a quote. I said before.
Did you say bloviate?
Yeah, before we bloviate on anything geopolitical, we have to talk about the political economy behind it.
Yeah, that's what he said. That's what he said. And I read that for 15 times. And then I was like, well, let me get a quote from the article that he sent and get out of his way, because he looks like he's in a mood.
Vaughn, you've been on some cynical posting tip on your social media lately, bro.
Says the pot to the kettle.
Yeah, I suppose
don't crush the kids.
Well, maybe the kids need to be slapped around a little bit.
All right. Well, before Varn gets CPS called on him, let's go. In many ways, it appears that Russian President Putin is playing chess while the West is playing checkers, such as NATO moving troops to Eastern Europe while leaving Ukraine exposed. Russia only has designs on Eastern Ukraine, and our assessment is that Russia has the non-dollar reserves, power over EU energy flows, popular support in Russia, and firepower to accomplish their goal of a USSR-style buffer zone separating them from the West. So what's going on?
Yeah, this is crucial to why I think we should actually talk about the political economy of something and not just the geopolitics, because it's easy to get lost in the political maneuvering that the Democrats are doing, and that Biden's doing, particularly because Biden's concerned about seeming weak after his, opinion polls on Afghanistan were all over the place. But we have to look at what the bourgeoisie is telling itself. And Matthew Fox is the author of this article, but Fox is actually just taking the key points of a fiscal analysis from the stock market analytical firm Stifel, STIFEL, FEL, who, believe it or not, if you read between the lines, not just in Ukraine, but also on China-U.S. policy, tells you way more about what's going on than anything you're going to read probably in the popular political media or even in the left political media as it stands in the United States. The bourgeoisie, while it is often at odds with itself, does not lie to itself very often. Now, what you can get from this quote is at least the financial bourgeoisie is not particularly sanguine about the build-up to possible war. It's not necessarily against a conflict with Russia, if you kind of read between the lines, but it's just very realistic about the odds. There's a paradox of Russian power that's implied in this, and it's something that I don't think leftists really understand. Russia has, let's say, most of the world's energy reserves, even probably more than the Middle East. And Russia has the firepower left over from its development of the USSR and its own modern development and its investment in its own military, which Putin has spent a decade and a half really revitalizing, to be a threat that's different from an economy that is really not an economic player on the world stage. And we have to remind ourselves of that. Now, you may commonly hear that Russia's, contribution to the global economy is roughly that of Italy. And that's true. in terms of raw economic exchange and in terms of influence. But what that is misleading is Russia's influence is in some of the most powerful sectors of the economy, particularly if you're Europe. And the other thing we should keep in mind when we talk about Russia's goals right now is that we should not just assume that, as some leftists do, that its agenda is purely innocent. It's doing some other things that would concern the European leftists, such as running war games to capture fisheries off the coast of Ireland. And Ireland, while it is in the EU, is neutral in regards to NATO, and thus that cannot be viewed as a direct hostility towards NATO. It is using a neutral state to make a point. But all that said, Russia's main goal is to reestablish a zone of regional autonomy to shore up its economy. The USSR style buffer is partly economic, trying to increase its economic pull in the region. Now, the reason why the U.S. cares about that, other than its normal world hegemony issues, is the U.S. and Europe together, as long as they stay together, are still bigger productive powers than China. In fact, China is number one in production, but the U.S. and the EU go back and forth on number two. The EU as a whole. We're not worrying about, any particular nation state within the EU, nor are we, frankly, we're not giving a shit about UK here either. And so Russia doesn't have a whole lot of pull or direct threat to the U.S. economy, but it has a whole lot of pull and direct threat to the European economy due to its control of energy flows. This cannot be underestimated. And the ability for the U.S. let me rephrase that. The ability for parts of the U.S., because I think we often speak about the U.S. monolithically foolishly. Because if the U.S. was monolithic, it would be clear that we would not be risking going to war over Ukraine, because the bourgeoisie does not benefit from that. But the bourgeoisie is not monolithic, and we can get into that too. But the military-industrial complex, as it is, was able to use Saudi Arabia and to take advantage of Saudi Arabia's tensions with Iran in specific to encourage Saudi Arabia to overproduce oil at the expense of the U.S.'s own shale and fracking gas industries. Now, I point that out because that decision, we can say, oh, the U.S. did this. Well, yes, the U.S. geopolitical players did it, but that was one side of the bourgeoisie in the U.S. running over another. Whereas Saudi interests in that were very clear. But there is no interest for Saudi Arabia to do that now. All right. Furthermore, the value of oil is continuously depreciating, but Europe still needs energy and can't get it without Russia. Not easily. So it's something that we have to look at here. Now, what's driving U.S. aggression on this point is more interesting. One, you will notice that the rhetoric, the prior Cold War rhetoric between the U.S. and China has been depleting from both sides. Both Xi has been talking about mutually beneficial transaction and trying to basically just enforce the U.S. recognize China as an fully equal partner in the world. Although there's still tensions there, and one should not underestimate those tensions. But the push towards anything like a war footing has been drastically reduced by both sides. And that makes perfect sense. The U.S. the U.S. and China are two of the productive capitals of the world, and nobody in the world trade system wants those two things to be blown to smithereens. There might be factions of the U.S. military who do, but I bet if we took a sampling of officers, we find that they don't think that's a viable threat either. But with that decreasing, it's actually kind of an imperative for Russia to assert its own ability to create a buffer area and to reduce U.S. influence, and possibly to break up the transatlantic assumption of allegiance between Europe and the U.S. China would maybe benefit from that, but it's really it's not in China's interest one way or the other. So it's just going to stay out of the fray on that. Russia has a lot of reasons because of NATO expansionism in particular to be worried about the U.S. pivoting its imperial forces onto its border. We must assume that while some of Russia's tactics, like I mentioned, its war games off the Irish Sea, can't be assumed to be innocent, we also have to assume that they're rational players who really only have regional strategic goals, and most of them are just defensive. So, of course, we should oppose the war with... Yeah, there's all kinds of complications of what's going on there. But of course, we should oppose any war with Russia, and even maybe take a defeatist attitude towards the United States if there is such a skirmish. That does not mean, however, that we should assume that Russia's goals in the Ukraine are going to be good for even Eastern Ukrainians, that they may or may not. We should not assume that that what's driving this is like an expansion of capital, because frankly, I bet you both productive capital and finance capital is scared shitless of this getting out of control. And that's what this report indicates. This report is not about geopolitics. This report is about economic stability in the U.S. and the future of the stock market. So you should put that in mind. And this is where you should probably be getting a lot of your news. All right. Another thing that comes up in this report that's not mentioned here, but is mentioned in another part of it, is the relative strength of the Chinese yuan. And that's not come up because for years and years and years and years and years and years, the U.S. primary tactical complaint, both from the political side of our power base and from the bourgeoisie, was that China was devaluing its currency against the U.S., creating a stronger dollar, but hurting our export business and helping our import business. But right now, the reverse is true. China has set its bank exchange rates, and unlike the pound or the USD or most reserve currencies of the world, where the states have currency sovereignty, China does not free float its currency. The report here is that while there's a variety of reasons for current inflation, I blame QE, although MMTers will tell me that's theoretically not possible. I disagree with them on that. And I can explain all that to your listeners another time if you want me to. What the supply chains plus declining profits plus trying to outstrip labor gains so to make sure that prices are set higher than any cost for labor is only part of the inflation picture. The other part of the inflation picture is the U.S., while it is still the reserve currency of the world, does not necessarily dominate world trade anymore. And by that I mean the U.S. dollar. And this report points out 33% of all currency transactions in the world now happen in yuan. While the yuan is not a reserve currency because it's not freely floated, it is a trading currency. And thus, it plays a role in U.S. inflation. And finance capital, at least, would like for the traditional, quote, traditional, the 20-year stance of China to weaken its costs for exports to... Yeah, that stimulus has nothing to do with this at all.
Don't get sound loud by the chat
yeah.
going.
Yeah, you're right.
My bad. I'll stop doing that. I didn't know it was fucking with you. My bad.
What I would say is, anyway, what you will see now is that U.S. doesn't have as much power to set the terms of its currency. By the way, this should concern us. Investors are also afraid of inflation, but they're also afraid of the Fed becoming hawkish, which it is. Janet Yellen and company have announced that in March they're likely to raise interest rates. Historically speaking, an inflation problem in the economy and stagflation in the economy is preceded by a crash. Usually when the Fed raises interest rates. Now, there are a variety of theories on the left for why this is the case. And some of that has to do with in modern monetary theory, which is, the predominant left-wing theory on the left, despite everyone's talking about Marxism, that's most of people's economic theory these days.
Whoa. You believe that?
I don't believe it's true. I believe that's what most people, if you look at people's policy proposals, that's what they're proposing.
You believe that most of today's non-existent left are MMT people?
Yes, because Bernie was an MMT person.
I think Bernie flirted with having MMT people on his staff, but he never made any overt propositions based in MMT.
Wasn't Stephanie Kelton part of that staff?
She's part of his team. She's the one I'm talking about.
Isn't she kind of the?
It's not just that. It's also Andre Bernal. There was about 7 of them, and they're actually still writing policy for the squad. Also, if you actually look at what most people consider Marxism, it's underconsumptionist, which rhymes with MMT. It's kind of where MMT's historical origins are. I say that I don't think it's true. I don't think it's
true that most of the left are MMTers, or you don't think what MMTers are?
I don't think MMT is true. I don't think MMT is actually true.
I'm going to reserve my commentary, but I'm going to reserve my commentary.
Is that an after hours discussion? Do I have to table that for the after hours?
Listen, my position on MMT is that it's rooted in 2 simple realities. America stays the reserve currency of record for the world, and that America stays the most powerful military industrial empire on the planet.
But it confuses liquidity and value in a way that fundamentally undoes Marxism. You cannot be a Marxist and an MMTer. Absolutely cannot.
I think it's absolutely true based on the fact that it's based on one state sovereignty.
Right, exactly. And anybody who, I think empirically the descriptive part of modern monetary theory is true, but not for the reasons they think, because they think any country can do it. And I only think imperial countries with large militaries that can enforce trade can do it.
You got to have the two factors that I just mentioned. You got to be the reserve currency of record, which is only the United States, particularly the petrodollar. You got to have military muscle, which is the U.S.
Yeah, exactly. So we're not actually in disagreement. What I find concerning is a lot of the left has picked up both tacitly, the way they think spending works and what we should be concerned about, like how we fund things. You might hear a little bit of peons to tax the rich, but the fundamental funding preposition is about basically we can manage capitalist economics through central planning, mostly through spending. And the MMT side of that encourages spending without taxation. Taxation becomes a function only to reduce inflation if we hit max productivity capacity, whatever they call that. I think the reason why I kind of think we have to point this out is there's a reason why even the left, the squad or whatever, won't actually really do anything to oppose military spending if they believe in anything like MMT.
I think you're being generous in their level of intellectual sophistication.
That's probably true, but I would also suspect that at least some of their advisors are thinking about this. What I think goes on in regards to if someone said, for example, that the stimulus is not, doesn't outstretch GDP. Well, the stimulus has almost no effect on inflation in the United States. Like literally none. And the QE and the stimulus are not remotely the same thing. The QE is QE here is just floating. It's basically creating what would be under the market non-liquid assets because they'd be tanked and normal conditions, and they would just be paper assets into liquidatable assets through effectively negative interest loans. All right.
Printing is just printing money.
It's basically just printing money. Technically, it's, technically there's loans going on, but it's printing money, but it's not just putting it in general circulation. It's putting it into the circulations, particularly in stocks and to the banks. Right. So in reality, if we want to talk about it, it's it's something that's good for investors because it inflates their paper assets. The reason why I disagree with MMT on what happens when the Fed raises the or why it happens when the Fed raises the interest rate is what I think what the Fed does is actually when it does that, it is showing what the profitability margins in real terms really are. So why there is a depression is kind of because the ability to use liquidity to hide value becomes harder and harder to do when you raise the interest rates. But what I also find interesting is MMTers, for example, will say that only inflation above like 10%, only hyperinflation hurts the poor, and that the rich are the people who are really pushing against inflation. And I just want to point out that, like, objectively speaking, in every report I read from stock market analysis, that's not true. They actually do not want these inflated assets to be deflated by a raise of interest rates. They absolutely don't. There might be certain sectors of capital that do, but the financial sector does not.
Well, listen, raising rates after pretty much 20 years of interest rate deflation policy is going to be a nightmare.
Oh, it's going to be a disaster.
According to what I read before the new year, not only is the Fed planning to raise rates at least 3 times this year, but they're also planning to slow down QE. So that's a double whammy.
Right? And we should be clear about this. Go ahead.
What's very important for people to understand who really are not into this aspect of watching capitalism, which I wish the left was more focused on, is that the only thing that has been keeping this economy alive since 2008 is low interest rates and quantitative easing.
You're completely correct.
This is a Federal Reserve created pseudo recovery, which is not a recovery. It's literally a slow dripping bailout of financial services industries, the banks, and finance capital all over again.
And capital is terrified of the end of that basically cover up with paper assets.
Right. One more thing about MMT, and this is important, and I think you'll agree with me. Mm-hmm. The biggest mistake that I think MMTers make is they believe that the policies the ruling class and the Federal Reserve implemented to protect the lords of capital, i.e. quantitative easing and low rates, will be the same policies the ruling class will implement to promote Keynesianism. And I think that's ridiculous.
Yeah. I think it ignores fundamental relations of production. Like, even if you throw out, declining rates of profit stuff and stuff that I really believe in, it's that why would the bourgeoisie give up its power that way? Like, it makes no sense. Like, they have power over workers through these policies running a certain way.
MMTers are as realistic as the black folk thinking they're going to get it from reparations.
Well, yeah, and sometimes they're the same people. So all that said, the one thing I want to mention about this, though, is we should be very concerned about the pink wave. I was just talking to Alex Uchili from BungaCast on my own show. It'll come out tomorrow.
Love Alex.
Yeah. And we were talking hard economic stuff, and we're like, well, Lula and stuff are in trouble because most of these Latin American economic things, while they're pivoting towards more trade with China, they're still dependent on a loose dollar. And when the Fed starts sucking that up with these interest rates raisings, it's going to reverberate through the world economy, and it's going to hit our sphere of influence, our most directly imperialized friends to the south first. And it's going to really mess up their abilities to do reform agendas without international coalition. So most of these national projects are going to be in deep trouble when the Fed raises its interest rates. So we have to, as good socialists, actually understand this stuff, because it doesn't just affect us in America, it affects the entire world. And that's really all I have to say on that.
Oh, and then you ended like Forrest Gump. That's all I have to say about that. Mic drop. I wish I had a mic drop thing, but I have this. The more you know. See Derick Varn. But I do want to put a pin on a little bit of that MMT discussion, because I definitely want to go back to it in the champagne room, especially with Camilo, as we will be talking about Latin America. But Pascal, you have something you would like to discuss, and that is the current situation with voting rights. Voting reform advocates also won a huge victory this week in Alabama after federal judges blocked the state's redistricted map on the grounds that it discriminated against Black voters. The American Civil Liberties Union of Alabama cheered the decision, quote, as a result of the preliminary injunction, the state legislature must draft a new congressional map that complies with the Voting Rights Act by including 2 districts where Black voters have the opportunity to elect candidates of their choice. The group said in a written statement, it noted, while Black people are about 27% of Alabama's population, they are represented in only 1 of 7, that's 14%, congressional districts. A new map must be drawn to correct that deficiency.
Thank you for bringing me into this segment, Jason. Obviously, what this article is about is the fact that in a federal case in Alabama, Black voters, with the help of the ACLU and other voter rights advocate legal teams, got a decision to basically argue that the attempt to redistrict the map in the state of Alabama to basically neutralize or kind of diminish the districts in a way to lower the capacity of Black elected officials being chosen, because the Black voters will be merged into largely more kind of heterogeneous areas, is being challenged. And they won on I think the lower level, federal level, but it's going to be appealed to the Court of Appeals. And what I find interesting about this Black elected official is that it demonstrates something no one is really talking about. What it demonstrates is that one of the major motivations behind Clyburn and the Congressional Black Caucus and the Black political class fighting these voting rights challenges is not so much that they're worried that the physical ability of Black people to vote is going to be hindered. I'm not saying they don't care about that. What they're worried about is the ability of the Republicans to stop the proliferation and growth of the Black political class. Think about this, because what this lawsuit is saying is that the way the Republican Party is structuring this map is going to limit the ability of Black citizens voting for Black representatives, right? Well, if the argument of the Black left has been that for over 50 years, Black elected officials have been more interested in protecting the interests of capital than protecting the interests of their Black constituency. Why exactly should we as Black leftists be shedding tears for a mechanism that's going to weaken the power of the Black political class? Now, of course, we don't want the ability of Black people to vote to be diminished or lost or weakened. But at the same time, I don't think there's enough interrogation being done about what exactly is the real motivation behind taking certain types of voting challenges and disenfranchisement and prioritizing it over other types. And why exactly is the Black political class vested in securing particularly problems with redistricting that limits their ability and capacity to proliferate and expand? Because what I'm finding interesting is how Jim Clyburn, there's an article in The Hill where Clyburn calls for full court press on voting rights, where Jim Clyburn is basically trying to pressure Joe Biden to issue an executive order to protect voting rights or try to force a change in the filibuster to allow protection of voting rights, which failed recently because Sinema and Manchin sided with the Republicans. But what I'm seeing here is that I don't particularly believe that the nature of the new voting changes being about denying Black people the capacity to actual vote is the issue. I believe that the Black political class is more concerned about these things because the way in which the structuring of these laws are affected in states, yes, they may have a negative effect on Black voter turnout, limiting early voting and things of that nature, and we should not support that. We should be fighting against these voter disenfranchisement measures. They're unfair and they're unjust. But what's fascinating to me is that few people are talking about the particular interest of the Black political class in that these laws threaten their ability to proliferate and maintain their sovereign control over Black politics, because on state levels, the districts will be drawn in a way where their seats are no longer secure. And I think that's an aspect of this voting rights struggle and discourse that no one really wants to talk about, because everyone wants to talk about the immorality and the racial injustice of. I think, number one, that's part of the problem. Because these voting rights laws are not written in a way that's saying we're denying Black people the ability to engage in early voting or this or that. And I think that posing this problem in a racialized methodology, frankly, is diminishing the outrage people feel about the phenomenon. Because I'm going to tell you right now, there are a lot of Black folk outside of the Black elite who are not even concerned about this voting rights stuff. Because they're, based on what they're saying, they didn't get a return on their investment in their vote for Biden, and they overall are frustrated with the Democratic Party. So if you have segments of Black folk who are not really motivated about this quote-unquote wave of disenfranchisement, we can only imagine those communities that are not particularly sensitive to the concerns of Black folk, how tired they are of hearing about this kind of stuff. So why exactly does this have to be framed as a racial justice matter and not one of political justice? Again, another example of how I think race reductionist framing limits the political salience and effectiveness of campaigns that disproportionately affect Black and brown communities, but affect everyone overall. Any thoughts?
It's an interesting bind to be in that it's pretty clear that the Black political elite has long benefited from basically subsuming their own base and for Black representation against the base of even the Democrats as a whole. I mean, we've known since ProPublica broke this stuff 10 years ago that most of the Black caucus have made deals with very conservative Republicans to maintain seats at the expense of Democratic power in those states. And that's part of why it's taken Georgia, for example, so long to be a purple state as opposed to a red one. The political economy of this, though, it gets people into a kind of primary contradiction, because who's supposed to as you said, who's supposed to represent Black interest, and yet it's clearly not in their interest to have Blacks represented fairly in the entirety of the politics, because they may not have such codified districts, and they might lose to a different kind of progressive, be they a different kind of person of color, basically an elite from another group in the progressive union. And I think this is something we have to look at when we are like talking about like DSA strategy or whatever, and why so many of these things get into cul-de-sacs, right? Like it's not necessarily that, say, the Black Congressional Congress does not want Black representation. It clearly does, but it doesn't want it at the expense of their own representation in Congress.
Exactly.
And this has kind of been amongst even liberal politicos. This has been a known quantity since I think at least 2010, 2012. But it's becoming more and more obvious and more intense. And there's no easy way to fix it either, because even a bipartisan or nonpartisan electoral map drawing field will have a hard time not appeasing to bipartisanship through trade-offs like this. And one of the criterion that's often used in these nonpartisan or bipartisan map drawing boards is that, quote, historical communities are preserved, which is like code for we allow for racial voting blocks, which of course they can't say because that would be unconstitutional. So I think this is going to be a bigger problem for the Democrats, particularly since every indicator is they're going to be crushed in the next election, and they also don't seem to have much local gain to about these things. So even in Alabama, for example, you get better congressional maps, is more fairly proportioned. I still don't think you don't flip the state with that in the current political climate. So it's not going to help. There's little incentive for the Democrats to actually use this to their benefit, because they're going to chalk up these areas to a loss anyway. And I don't think this is for people who think this is totally U.S. insider ballgame problems. If you study Deb Burrows in the UK and whatnot, you see similar patterns. This is a constant thing in bourgeois democracies with these historical community demographics being used in a way to create weird, to basically game democracy to a more oligarchic fashion. It's almost innate to parliamentarianism. The U.S. has it the worst because we have one of the least democratically responsive constitutions for a, quote, democracy, unquote, but it's you see it everywhere. It's not unique to us.
Yeah. Jason, have any thoughts?
I'm just the host. You guys don't pay for my opinion.
Hey, aren't you supposed to have a story right now, Jason?
No, you two are supposed to talk for another 20 minutes. So keep talking, Pascal, because I end the show. Since we have to put the show outlines up now publicly, I take the last 5 minutes.
You take the last 5 minutes. Well, hey, I mean, it seems like everyone wants to really hammer on about this MMT discourse that we were having. No one gives a damn about black voters. That's for sure.
Sorry, I think the Alabaster followed me.
Proving my point, by the way.
Does that say more about our viewing audience, or does that say more about the fact that no one just gives a damn about black voters? Mainly because
maybe the fact that the problems of black voters are marketed as black problems is one of the reasons why people don't give a fuck. If you just marketed it as voter problems, maybe more people would give a fuck.
I agree.
Yeah, I mean, the problems of white voters are not usually framed as white voter problems because immediately people wouldn't give a fuck, including a lot of white people. So, like, you can tell, you can actually tell priorities by who doesn't get an adjective in front of them.
Yep.
Ooh. Yeah. Someone says both. Someone says they care about both.
Only when during major election people.
Don't black erase me, Cal. Sorry, Gigi. Nobody cares about. I thought this was going to be an interesting discussion. To be honest with you,
I think the problem is we agree on it.
Of anyone that has a lot to say about gerrymandering and the black vote in a black district, it is Sean King. And thank you, Sean, for being here. You have stood up for all of us during anytime a cop gives a ticket in even an adverse way to a colored man. Sean, you are there to tweet about it, write about it, and somehow profit off it. So we appreciate your work. That being said, in all honesty, jokes aside, Derick actually has some interesting takes on the black political class and how they benefited from some of the gerrymandering in black areas, because you grew up in Georgia.
You grew up in Georgia. And I grew up, like, my community was my community, like community means anything, but the area in which I lived was 50-50 white black. So, and it became 60-40 white 60-40 black white, excuse me, during my lifetime, largely because of upper middle class white flight. For
the audio only podcast, someone just wrote, to be honest, I thought MMT was Marxist, Maoist, Trotskyist.
That's confused. But one thing I would say, though, I mean, one thing we have to look at, the economy of a lot of the black regions of the country is the most deracinated. I actually think we have to even look at, like, not just from the effect of black voters, but as voter issues in general, is that by some of these agreements, working class people who do not feel represented by the black, by black political elites, and also do not feel represented by conservatives, are actually shut out. And in these areas, what you see is, except in very alarmist election years like the prior one in 2020, general voting is way down in those areas, even compared to the rest of the United States, which is way down in anyway. And so these things actually are demotivators for working class participation across the board, both at the expense of the interest of, quote, the black community, unquote, and of the interest of the white community of working class people, unquote, as opposed to white wealth holders. And we all know also, talking about white people as if they're all the white wealth holders is really misleading if you start adjusting for classes within racial groups, which, of course, people who talk about these racial things, as Pascal has talked about over and over and over again, do not do. There's pretty good reasons for that. I mean, like, even going back historically to the ability of the South to suppress the ability of the Southern bourgeoisie and aristocratic planter class to suppress any wage growth at all by playing the desperation of black workers, and thus their ability to scab on the ability of workers in general to strike, and thus actually exacerbating racial tensions and incorporating white people into, like, this nebulous fictional, like, heron folk that doesn't actually exist. it led to a point like in the 30s, the average white worker in the South made less than the average black worker in the North. Like, and this is a fact that we just do not talk about. And it was done by playing racial tensions and exacerbating racial tensions. And in fact, it was done to the point that like certain of these strikes made groups that were not considered white, such as the Cornish, everyone knows about the Irish, but the Cornish, the Manx, various mine working groups who were shut out of like WASP society, they were pushed into identifying with whiteness by these particular events, because someone like Carnegie would actually not only bring in black workers, he would bring in black workers to break up a strike and then market it to the liberals as a progressive move. And I think we have to look at the way these voting districts are being run in a similar pattern. And I think Pascal's absolutely right about that. And it means we shouldn't have a lot of faith in the Democrats having any incentive to actually fix this, just to talk about it.
Yo, this is some good talk, Varn. We're talking about populist era stuff or a little bit post-populist era?
But it's populist era to early socialist era. So it's between 1890 and 1930.
Got any good sources? Talk to me.
Oh man. There's a good history of the Socialist Party. And I would also read a history of the IWW. Anything on the miners' strikes, and particularly the miners' strikes in the South. Believe it or not, there was a good liberal podcast. Well, I guess Robert Evans is a good liberal podcast about a year ago on Robert Evans on the miners' strikes. It goes into
Robert Evans, the movie producer?
No. Robert Evans, the anarchist journalist who does a podcast called Behind the Back.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm like the narration movie producer guy has a bunch.
No, I mean Robert Evans is a pretty old honky name, so but he lives in Portland, so I guess calling him a honky is appropriate.
I have a couple of books on the populist era, but I don't think they really go into this particular detail you're talking about.
You know what we say about Portland, Varn? Right.
It's
Portland
white Atlanta
for white people.
I call it where I call Oregon where white people go to retire and stick fight, but that's just me.
Is where white people go to get away from brown people, but they blame it on the scenery. They're like, it's so green here. It's beautiful and green and lush valleys, and it's less brown.
Yeah, apparently Robert Evans is originally from Texas, and I'm not being fair to him. And I really not. I would say he does a good show on this, particularly on Carnegie, because Carnegie. This was a tactic Carnegie perfected, and it was also the moment where a lot of Celtic immigrants started identifying as white. Like it is these minor strikes, and particularly in the 19 teens and 20s. And it was vile because a lot of what would happen is that the workers could not get to, because of the various private security forces, be they Baldwin men or Pinkertons. They could not get to the bourgeoisie, but they could get to the black people brought in the scab, and they would just kill them and lynch them. And as W.E.B. Du Bois actually talks about this, like being one of the primary drivers of racism, and it's why he increasingly, as he broke away from Booker T, broke off from became more and more of a Marxist in the early 20th century, was seeing that, even though he's talking about white skin privilege and all that, he's also acknowledging that what's driving this is real economic insecurities. They're not made up. They're not just paranoia. And unfortunately, when like progressive liberals talk about this today, also because they confuse the white petite bourgeoisie with the white working class, that's a whole nother problem. They make it sound like these white workers didn't have anything really that they were concerned about, and they absolutely did. And if you read about their conditions, it's absolutely horrifying. And basically, this was able to just play jingoism off each other. I mean, one of the things that they would do it wasn't just black. The movie Maitland goes into this a little bit, but it wasn't just like black people they bring in Catholic immigrants, particularly Portuguese and Italian, but also because they couldn't speak English usually. But what those movies don't often portray is like they were bringing them against other immigrant groups, like I said, the Manx and the Cornish. So this is like a forgotten history of America, and even a lot of left-wing histories don't go into it. Like you really have to look into labor history, and you kind of have to read between the lines.
Well, on that note, we'll have our parting word before we head into the champagne room where Camilo is very patiently waiting to talk about the goings on, the pink tide in Latin America, and the implications of what Varn was talking about earlier with the economy. I'm excited to dig deep into this conversation. But before we go, I do want to talk about something that I was watching and reading about recently in the news. Pascal, while you're adjusting yourself in your chair, I'm giving you shit. You know who Neil Young is, right, Pascal?
Of course.
And Derick, of course, you know who Neil Young is. You live in Utah and you're white. If you don't know who Neil Young is, you're doing something wrong. Neil Young has some beef with everybody's favorite person to beef with, Joe Rogan.
Yeah, I saw that.
There's a story making the rounds in the news, both mainstream and even in our small leftist realm. That is the story of classic rock icon Neil Young against music streaming giant Spotify. Young, upset over Spotify's platforming of podcaster Joe Rogan's often controversial COVID coverage, said it's either you or me, my catalog of music, or your $100 million investment in Rogan and his Joe Rogan experience. Spotify took down Young's music from its platform in favor of their podcasting giant Joe Rogan. But there is something this conversation is missing. There's a performative aspect to Young's very public protest. Young sold 50% of the rights to his music a year ago to a company called Hypnosis. It's a song fund management company that invests in companies like Morgan Stanley, Bruin Dolphin, BNY Mellon, and the investment arm of the Church of England. From a recent article in the Baffler, all of the above are investors in Hypnosis Song Fund Limited, a UK-based song management company creating shareholder value by buying and exploiting the copyrights to successful music catalogs. At the start of this year, they paid around at the start of the year 2012, they paid around, or 2021, they paid around $150 million to acquire 50% of Neil Young's publishing rights. On its face, it's a musician risking his financial livelihood to stand against a corporate giant. In reality, Young has no power and no real stake in the canceling of his music from Spotify's streaming service. But that factoid does not matter to the many people caught up in the theater of this perceived battle of integrity. Why? Why do we get so caught up in the drama and not examine the more insidious nature of the predatory practices of companies that buy up the intellectual property of older artists and even younger songwriters? How does this monopoly over the contemporary music landscape affect new artists? How does this new gamble on the future royalties of music change the way music is consumed? That conversation can't be had because we have to watch the mudslinging and punditry of who's winning the ideological fight. I recently watched a 90-minute inverted commas debate on why a predominant leftist podcaster supports progressive politicians. I'm still trying to find out why this was even a point of contention, especially since the person inferring that supporting progressive in Congress is problematic was a self-proclaimed, Derick, maybe you've heard of this, Marxist-Leninist patriot.
Oh, yeah. I've heard of this new movement. Anyway,
ML Patriots?
Well, yeah. Hey, hold on. Let me finish. I'm not here to judge who won what and who got owned, as that isn't politics. That's kids talking shit on the playground. That's child's play. Much like how the Neil Young versus Joe Rogan debate obfuscates some serious discussion on how market forces influence music and popular culture, it can't be had while we engage in kneecapping one another on a small-time clout chase for engagement. As we talk today about the stock market in flux and voting rights that were gained some 50 plus years ago, they're being rolled back. These issues are far more important than insignificant purity posturing and online flame wars. And on that note,
you did that yourself, didn't you? Oh, good for Chris. Keep on rocking in the free world. Keep on rocking in the free world.
Jeremy says, what hat am I wearing? I'm wearing a Texas Chainsaw Massacre hat. That is, a lot of people know that, an anti-capitalist film. The reason why the family starts eating people is because they got fired from their factory job due to downsizing and outsourcing.
Keep on rocking in the free world.
Who says horror is always a reactionary genre? It wasn't
Horror of the 70s, which I really want to examine, and I'm down this with you, Varn.
That was Catherine Liu. Catherine Liu made that assertion.
A lot of the guys from the New Left were directors of that kind of first wave of slasher movies, and they were really trying to say something in that cinema, I feel, more so than what you see now, and definitely what happened in the early 80s with the things like Friday the 13th. While I've watched every one and will watch another one, it is literally a copy off of Halloween with no kind of commentary whatsoever.
Except sex is bad. That's the commentary.
That's like it. That's it. Like apparently sex is bad.
Yeah.
So
I finished the book today. I was very happy about that.
Well, we'll get into your book finishing. And in the great words of Layla Rashawn and Boomerang, gold star for Marcus.